Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to Society and the State. Today we're talking about the future. And to do that, there is a gentleman I've been watching, kind of been in his orbit for a while. He's been saying and writing a whole lot of things about how the future can and will change through technology and innovation and through social, spontaneous organization. It's going to be a fantastic episode. Brian and I are really excited to welcome Max Borders. Max is the founder of Social Evolution, an organization we're going to get into here. Max, thanks for coming on the show and talking with us a little bit.
My pleasure.
So you come from a background where I think you were more oriented, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you definitely were more oriented towards political change and trying to change systems through policy and ideas. It seems now you've kind of shifted away from that, where you think that the way to impact the future for the better is not necessarily through our political institutions, but through social organizations instead. Is that a fair way to kind of describe your own kind of shift over the years? If not, please correct me. But let's get into your new frame of thinking that social organization is going to be, this technological, innovative way to liberate humanity. So correct me if I'm wrong, and then let's take a bite out of this.
You are not wrong, and in fact, it kind of sounds crazy when I listen to you describe it this way, but it's actually right. I think we have had a civic religion of sorts of politics, policy, and punditry that has been pretty much the approach that everybody's taken, and that we'll call it the political frame has been is when a young person rises up through college and through the ranks goes all the way to Washington, D.C. They usually think of politics, policy, or punditry as their three choices. And it's taken me pretty much to my late 30s and into my 40s to realize that this is necessary but not sufficient.
Now, isn't that, I'm going to play a little devil's advocate with you because, of course, I think a lot of our audience and most people are definitely in the frame of thinking that it's through our political institutions that we're going to impact the future and improve our lives and increase freedom. And so isn't your new approach, wouldn't the devil's advocate position say it's a bit of defeatism? Are you advocating that we just kind of abandon the political process and, not vote and not pay attention and not, quote, get involved?
Well, I'm not saying I would advocate that. I might put it politely as yes and to what people generally do. So in other words, we really do need to think about holding up the bulwark of politics for human freedom. Because if you don't continue to man the barricades, as it were, you're going to be overrun by those who think that their angels are going to live at the highest levels of government. And so, sure, there has to be people who are engaged in the political process, particularly on a day-to-day basis. I'm not quite so interested in the idea of electoral politics. I do think it's probably a necessary evil, but it deals with this sort of unfortunate fact of aggregates. I mean, essentially, we're from a statistical standpoint, in any given election, if it's a national election, it's crying our teardrop in the ocean and expecting the tide to turn. Mm-hmm. I am, I'm less hopeful about that way of doing things unless it's highly localized, and that's better, but our emphasis doesn't tend to be, at least where I am and at least what I see, our emphasis tends to be on national issues because that's where the spectacle lies. That's where people are able to share stuff on social media and express their, to show their plumage, express their outrage or whatever. And the national spectacle really we don't have very much control over that. It's really locals where the action is, and that's what tends to be ignored. Perhaps not by your listeners, but by most people.
Now, in starting this organization, Social Evolution, your pitch is that you're trying to help people become liberated and solve social problems through innovation. So let's be specific, right? Because I sense that when we talk about the future and we talk about social change, we can use big words and abstract ideas and stay at a 10,000-foot level. What would be a specific example or two you would offer to point people towards your way of thinking that you believe that it's through innovation that we will be liberated and that we will solve these social problems? Can you offer an example or two just so our listeners can kind of orient their minds a bit more to your way of thinking?
Sure. I think the most profound example already exists. And it definitely shook me to my core when I first learned about it. And I think a lot of people have come to that conclusion, while others think it's just this sort of funny little thing off in the distance. But let me address it by telling you a story. Around October of 2008, there were some guys, heads of banks, sitting around a table around this guy, Treasury Secretary at the time, Hank Paulson, who basically said, "You're going to take this money or else." And this came to be known as TARP, the biggest bank bailout in history. Not too far along after that, there was this white paper that came out in the cypherpunk community by a pseudonymous individual named Satoshi Nakamoto. And I'm sure your listeners have heard you talk about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. But that Bitcoin white paper really was not even, it was an absolutely revolutionary phenomenon. And I think we'll come to look at that just as we have come to look at the Gutenberg press and other major technological advancements in history that also changed our society. We have this idea, I don't even know if the guy actually said it, but he's credited with saying it. Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, says, "We shape our tools and then our tools shape us." And likewise, we can say we shape our rules and then our rules shape us. Technology allows us both to shape our rules and tools at the same time. And this is what Satoshi Nakamoto, or he or they or she, did with that white paper, is essentially to create law with code, where law is what we can actually do and choose as a rule set. It was sort of the first real big occasion in human history where the formalized idea of law, that we had this alternative to the formalized notion of law in money. Money is this thing we take for granted as being, given by the state and by the state's proxies and central banks. And that's that. And we sort of accept it and we go on and we spend our dollars and we hope that we can earn more of them so we can pay our taxes and put food on the table. But when Satoshi Nakamoto came out with the Bitcoin white paper, it basically eliminated not only the middleman of money, but the very idea that money had to be some sort of thing that was handed down from on high, that we all united around as a single standard of currency. That has given rise to so many other sort of projects and disintermediation that has been enabled by the distributed ledger technology known as the blockchain and other types of distributed ledger technologies that are not blockchain based. But this idea gives us so many opportunities for exit, from exiting systems that have outlived their usefulness. And that's really sort of what I'm looking at and where I think the most promise lies. I contrast that looking for exit options to using our voice. So this voice and exit contrast is, I think we've overinvested in voice and underinvested in exit up to 2009, but things are changing and changing rapidly.
Max, I have to tell you, so much of what you're saying is music to my ears. I came to the realization some time ago that I only have so much moral energy to which I can devote my efforts in any given day. And politics gives us the impression that, look, we're doing something, we're fighting, we're arguing, for this. I know on your website, Social Evolution, you liken it to a tug of war, and yet nothing really seems to get accomplished largely because in the end, the collective always seems to assimilate the individual. I wonder if you could give us some examples about ways that individuals can can step up through peaceful insubordination or evasion to avoid becoming part of the Borg?
Well, it's funny, we belong to a proud tradition of civilly disobedient people. The United States is certainly based on that sort of mind frame, and so it's not a paradox in my mind to think that we are going to continue to innovate opportunities for people to exit old systems and enter new systems. But to answer your question, really, in terms of examples of, they don't even have necessarily to be sort of grand things like monetary systems. I mean, Bitcoin is a profound example. There are others on the horizon that I think stand to really shake things up and offer alternatives to people who sort of long for that civil disobedience. But one of the even more common ones is Uber. Back around what I guess it was about 2012, sort of this company starts operating in this legal gray area that nobody had anticipated, which is what happens when we create a platform for people to connect, to use their capital, namely cars, and use their phones to hop in these cars to get around. I mean, it had been something only dreamt about in strange texts like that of David Friedman, that we would be hopping in each other's cars. And it was at a time when the very idea of hopping in someone's car was seen as dangerous at best. And what Uber allowed was not only, these layers of safety and transparency with this, but we flipped from an idea that sticking your thumb up, which was dangerous and unwise, to something that people do every day. I mean, this happened in about a minute on the scale of human history, and now it's almost unheard of that anyone would, except for the occasional city that wants to protect its taxi monopolies, that anyone wouldn't use Uber or Airbnb for that matter. And so we have this strange civil disobedience with what Karl Marx might have called the ownership by the people of the means of production. And so we have this interesting phenomenon whereby people are making choices, and the aggregate effect of those choices is profound social change. Now, that can happen over and over again. Uber was one of the first. I call it subversive innovation. Uber was 1.0. Bitcoin was 1.0. 2.0 of subversive innovation is going to be really, really interesting.
Now, Max, you've written a book that I think is in pre-release stage right now. I got a copy from you a couple weeks ago, and it's been fun to flip through it. The title alone suggests what the broader idea is. I'll read the title for our listeners. We'll link to this, to your organization's website and other resources at the show notes page for today, which is societyandthestate.com/96. Your book is titled The Social Singularity, How Decentralization Will Allow Us to Transcend Politics, Create Global Prosperity, and Avoid the Robot Apocalypse. But how does decentralization play into this? We think of it so often in terms of the political sense, right? We need to diffuse power, we need to decentralize, we need to localize, and that way there's no like apex of authority that people can wrestle over and then compel everybody else to do what they want, and then we have this cage match every 4 years or 2 years where people are trying to wrest control of that centralized power. So speaking more on the innovation side, the social change outside of politics, how does decentralization play into this concept of the social singularity that you're evangelizing?
Well, and what's interesting about this is decentralization, I think that people rightly point out, is not an end in itself. The point of decentralization is to allow people to develop and enter into their own sovereign communities. And that is difficult to do when the rule sets are made for you and they're an accident of birth. So historically speaking, the rules by which we play are, and being an accident of birth means that they arose from conquest. somebody got a hold of some patch of territory, then held on to it over time and made the rules. This is generally what human history looks like. So we almost don't know how to separate the idea of rule sets or the law from the territory under it. But that is changing. Bitcoin, again, is a good example. Other systems that we can enter into, any system we can enter into that is not attached to territory is a new way of governing ourselves. So I use these terms, the two Ps, to try to unpack this a little bit. And that means that the politics has still got a dog in this fight to some degree, but I think it's going to be a form of politics that is much more highly localized and much more decentralized. And that is polycentrism. Polycentrism is a fancy word for breaking up power to make sure that it's not so centralized. So we no longer outsource our sense of responsibility to our fellow man, for example, or any other responsibility that we might consider part of the common good. We no longer outsource that to distant capitals. It makes little sense, for example, to outsource our sense of responsibility to Washington, D.C. if we live in Austin, Texas, where I am, or in Utah, where you guys are. This sense of looking after each other is about a renaissance in forming those invisible ties, those filaments of community that arise by virtue of collisions that people have with each other, and even beneficial collisions, some of which are based on common mission and common need. Those kind of communities sprout up in ways that are almost impossible to design by central authorities. When we recognize those accretions of community, we have to say that's where the real action is, and therefore that's where the real power ought to be. And yet politicians in distant capitals don't really care about those communities, nor do they care about, they're more interested in blanket monolithic policies that they can impose over the people in the name of some abstract ideological notions of the good. And of course, that's what's causing so many of the fractures, political fractures and acrimonious exchanges on Facebook and the rest of it, is that we are finding it more and more difficult to self-organize into communities of practice and localized power. So that's the first thing. That's the first fancy P, is polycentrism. We've got to break up power that's associated with territories. But there's also another fancy P called polyarchy. And that's the idea that there's very little actual law that we need to have associated with territory. We might have a set of territorial goods and services that make sense, but to the extent that they don't, why shouldn't we be able to choose our governance from the cloud? So, for example, why shouldn't I be able to opt into the Singaporean healthcare system rather than the United States healthcare system? After all, a succession of crappy policies over the years has trashed the U.S. healthcare system to a very great degree. And the Singapore system is much more patient-directed. I prefer that one. Why can't I opt into it? So polyarchy is the idea of opt-in law, where we can select from among governance frameworks. We really need not be ideologues about it. If you have a system of competitive governance where you can choose different conceptions of the good and therefore different legal systems and opt into them, may the best system win. They compete. This is crazy to a lot of people when I start talking about this, because all they've ever known is rules attached to territory. But when we really get down to it, unless we're trying to force our conception of the good on 350 million people or beyond, then we really don't need rules to be attached to territory at all.
Max, something you said a moment ago struck me, because I like everything that you're saying. Polycentric law, I think, is a must. It is the way to a better future. You said something, though, about forming these communities and allowing people to group together in common cause and look out for one another. How does something like mutual aid play into this, right? Because even people who might argue over any given government policy usually concede that, well, we need a safety net. The government is there to look out for people. That's why we need taxes. That's why we need government, other than, I guess, the roads, right? But social welfare becomes such a compelling argument for people to accept the state and to accept the status quo. You're painting the picture of a different future. How does something like mutual aid and helping one another play into the world that you're describing?
It is absolutely essential to it, and I'm really glad you asked this, because it's funny, but I have this term I sort of made up that I'm calling synthesism. And it's the idea of it is, let's begin to synthesize what seem to be disconnected values. All right. What I mean by that is as follows. Let's take the liberal progressive, the left-wing person, and they'll say the following. They'll say, markets don't work for everything. We really need to care more about people, care more about our fellow man, with emphasis on care. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Now, their means of achieving that value might be something that we would find objectionable. But the idea that we ought to care more about our fellow man is not, in my view, objectionable. And I tend to agree that we can and should care about the most vulnerable people in society. The conservative, I think quite rightly, is going to say we should care about people. However, the means through which we care about them is important. The means are everything. And if we tend to have these centralized systems that sort of drop largesse from the sky without taking into consideration the individuals on the ground who might receive this largesse, we are essentially we're creating problems where we could be rewarding bad behaviors and creating intergenerational systems of poverty and dependency. I think the conservative in this respect is correct. And then the libertarian is going to come along and say, yes, but we still need the market process and market signals. You might not think that markets can do everything, but the market process is important, and we need to consider the rights of individuals, because after all, individuals are the constituents of any society. So none of them in these narrow respects are wrong. So how can we weave together something that will allow all of these folks to be right and unite in common cause rather than arguing? And the answer is one that was with us for probably more than 200 years in the idea of the fraternal society or mutual aid association. 1 in 3 Americans at the peak of the mutual aid movement before the rise of the welfare state, there were 1 in 3 Americans was a member of one of these mutual aid societies. That is staggering. That is absolutely staggering number to consider that 1 in 3 was involved in some mutual aid organization, whether it was the Rotarians, the Friendly Societies of the UK, the things that we've never heard of that have funny names, the Czech American organization. I mean, they were just innumerable. We have some of them left over, even the Masons. We have some of them left over today, but very, very few, and most of them have had to reinvent themselves in a way that's not really about mutual aid. That movement stalled and almost died for 2 basic reasons, and I don't want to put too much of a fine point on this and bore your listeners, but think of it this way: when the welfare state came up, you had suddenly a competitor that was very, very that was difficult to say no to because it was free. It's hard to compete with free. It was also taking resources from what could have gone to mutual aid in the form of taxation, which left fewer resources for the purposes of being a good steward in civil society, which mutual aid is a part of that. You also had this problem of which infects any sort of social insurance like pool, which is called adverse selection and moral hazard. These are 2 economics terms that it took us a while to figure it out. But basically, if you get the incentives wrong, it's easy for people who are high risk to get into one of these organizations and people who are lower risk to leave them. So you have to program the incentives in such a way for any risk pool to ensure that the right balance of people is in it, and then have strong community ties on top of it. These mutual aid associations existed for hundreds of years, so it's not like adverse selection completely destroyed them. But the combination of adverse selection and the rise of the welfare state virtually destroyed this sector. And to put a period at the end of this very long paragraph, want to create a renaissance in mutual aid.
I think it's very needed. I'm glad you had the answer that you did. We're going to additionally link to a book that I recommend on this. You're painting a picture of the future. I think in so doing, it's important to understand the past, a little bit of which you've referenced in terms of some of these mutual aid societies. There's a fantastic book that I acquired a couple years ago. It's called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services Between 1890 and 1967. It's amazing to see the way in which poor people were cared for. Not even that this was a transfer of wealth from wealthy people to poor people. In so many cases, it was poor people organizing directly with poor people. It was creating institutions where they could support people in the very same socioeconomic class as you alluded to with the Czech American thing. A lot of these were immigrant based, right? This was, hey, the Welsh Fraternal Society in America, right? And so it was all these Welsh immigrants who had nothing, but they banded together with this common identity and supported one another. You didn't have people dying in the streets. You had charitable hospitals. Ron Paul used to talk about this all the time, right? Like, look, healthcare wasn't that expensive when I was practicing. We routinely provided it for free. Anyone who walked in off the street, we cared for. And so it's these institutions, the welfare system and policies that have, as you say, frozen out the competition where we're not at now. We need to get back to that because it is a way that we could actually care for one another outside of coercive taxation, outside of all of this waste and these problems. So I'm going to link to this for any listener intrigued by today. There's two books then you got to get. You got to get this one to understand the history, and you got to get Max's book to talk and understand kind of the idea of the future and how technology and innovation can take us there. Max, there's a lot of thoughts. You have a conference. In fact, I guess we'll link to that as well, Voice and Exit. That's done annually, right? Aren't you doing that each year now?
Yeah, that's right. We've done it. This was our 5th year this year. It's absolutely, these kind of discussions are certainly a component of it. And I'd like to mention another piece for the show notes at the risk of seeming a little bit self-indulgent with my own stuff. But, it's fashionable lately for people to talk about a universal basic income. This is the fashionable policy proposal that a lot of people are getting behind because it seems like a grand compromise between the right and the left, as seen on a spectrum, where the right thinks, okay, the welfare state has become too bloated and there's this giant welfare administrative class that skims off the top. We can do better than that. Let's just write people checks. The left is, and so doing it's more efficient. The left thinks, people need a basic income in order to survive. We need to at least ensure subsistence for everyone through this kind of scheme. So I critique that in an article and then summarize that critique in one in particular called How We Become the Social Safety Net. This is just a Medium article, How We Become the Social Safety Net. And in that article, I had the most profound response to that article. It knocked me on my heels because I just didn't expect that kind of response. And it came from all parts of the political spectrum, which is why I sort of started this whole section with the discussion of being a synthesist, or an idea that we try to find the best in people's values, eliminate the weaknesses, and form new systems. In this article, I propose the idea of a DISC, which is an acronym for Distributed Income Support Cooperatives. And what's interesting about the DISC framework, and some really, really brilliant people, much smarter than I, are working on the particular governance process for this. But the basic outline of it is, how can we build a mutual aid arrangement with technology so that we don't have to be at the same place at the same time? We can have a large network of people who are connected in mutual aid and have, stave off problems of moral hazard and adverse selection and keep, both big fish and little fish in the pool, in the insurance-like pool. The thing that I love about what we're talking about here, and the thing that we lost with the rise of the welfare state, is community. Sometimes when you know who's getting some benefit from a community, you know whether or not that benefit is going to be ultimately good for them or not, or you have at least some sense. So if I'm unemployed yet again, only my community members know how to ask me whether or not maybe my drinking problem is the reason for my condition of unemployment, right? The government doesn't know this, nor does the government care. It's a blanket policy. And some people may feel uncomfortable with the idea that we would be so intrusive in one another's lives, but that's what churches do. So when you were talking about, the Czechs, the Welsh, the black community had one of the most robust mutual aid sectors prior to the 1930s, which was the first hit, and then the 1960s under the LBJ was the second big hit to the church network, the African American churches. They were some of the best mutual aid associations. And grandma would come in and pop you one before she gave you $20 to help you out of your fix. Mm-hmm. She might help you find a job rather than handing you that $20. She might tell you she'll help you, but you got to put down that bottle. But you don't get that with government welfare. So our question is, how can we reintroduce the local knowledge of community into this project of mutual aid? And the DISC framework is really where we're headed with that. And we're, it's risky, it's crazy. We're going to try it, but if I'm bound and determined to resurrect mutual aid, because I think the welfare state has been devastating to a lot of communities. And it looks like right now there's this sort of counter response to Trumpism that is democratic socialism. And democratic socialism is just the same old warmed over welfare state, dropping largesse from the sky on the poor ideas that we've already tried for the last 100 years. And it has given us nothing but heartache, I think.
Max, I think it's fair to say that big problems require bold solutions. What you guys are doing is definitely food for thought. I hope our listeners will take advantage of the resources, including the Medium article you mentioned. We will link to that as well at societyandthestate.com/96. Guys, check out the show notes page. Do a little more homework. Tickle your brain a little bit. This stuff's fun to think about, and we definitely need to figure out ways for a better future. Max Borders, thanks so much for taking some time to join us today.
Oh, gosh, I wish we had another hour. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.